I'm going to mix up our level 2 hydration beginner bread recipe, but I'm going to replace all of the water with beer. So if you follow me at all, then you know that everything I do is trying to simplify the process of sourdough so that beginners can do it. Our beginner bread recipe is low hydration, easier to manage, and then we provide a recipe that's just slightly higher hydration once you've mastered all of the essential processes. In the description of this video, I'll have linked how to decode what the essential processes are, all of the recipes you're going to need, all of our standard tutorials that are most used in our group on Facebook, the Sourdough for Beginners group. But today, I'm really excited about this. So the reason I talked about the simple is Bud Light is what my husband just happens to have in the fridge. So I stole a couple of them, and I'm just gonna do a regular sourdough recipe with no water and all beer and hope that it works out really well. So the level 2 hydration beginner recipe cut in half for a single loaf is 100 grams of active starter, 500 grams of flour, 10 grams of salt, and 350 grams of water. In this case, we're going to use 350 grams of beer. So all I do is take my starter. It's a little past peak. It's fallen, so that'll give it sort of more a sour taste, but it's going to work great. I'm going to tare my scale, and I'm going to put 100 grams of this starter in there. Again, this is just like the simplest, easiest recipe with the idea that you can use a recipe like this and only use the essential processes to get really comfortable as a beginner. And then you can start to add in some of the more advanced techniques or the optional processes from there. So from our perspective, the essential processes are: have an active starter, mix your loaf, do 3 to 4 stretch and folds with 30-minute rest in between. Allow your dough to bulk proof on the counter. We recommend proofing containers where you mark the height when it starts so you can see how high it's risen. Pre-shape, shape, bake. All the other processes that are out there are completely valid and should be used, like cold proofing, auto leasing, levains. They're just a little bit more complicated than a beginner perhaps needs right away. First, get this stuff down. So we've got 100 grams of starter in our bowl, and now we're going to add 350 grams of beer. I wonder if it's going to foam up a lot. Let's see. Okay, so we are at 350 grams, and it used about 2/3 of a Bud Light, like standard Bud Light tall can. We are in Canada, so that's 473 mils. I'm not sure what that converts to in your ounces in the States, but less than one Bud Light tall can is more than enough. I had 2 out just in case. But so now, just the same process as the beginner bread recipe. I'm just going to blend my starter into the beer. So I'm just going to whisk it up until the starter is completely dissolved and make a nice, like, sort of milky substance. So it's interesting. It is definitely getting more foamy than when we use water, but not a lot. And it smells like beer and sourdough mix, like right from the get-go. Because my starter's past peak, it means it's fermented a little more, which means I'll get more of a sour taste. So that was already pretty pungent. And then adding in this beer is doing it even more. So we'll just get this nicely whisked up. Definitely the whisking is foaming up the beer, but I think when it comes to sourdough, anything that bubbles is a good thing. So here, I'll show you how it looks now. It's like super foamy. Okay, so we're just going to tare our scale back to 0 and continue on with the beginner bread recipe. So for this one, I'm just going to use 100% basic all-purpose flour, 500 grams worth. You can use any blend you like, but I just am still practicing this recipe and perfecting it. And one of the things that I believe is that when you try something new, keep doing it exactly the same way so that it's easier to troubleshoot. So one little bit more. Okay, and now I'm going to just add my 10 grams of salt. Awesome. Okay, so just like always, I'm going to blend the salt and flour a little bit on top of the bowl. Then I'm going to use my spoon to mix this dough up as well as I can with the spoon until most of the water is absorbed by the flour. And then I'm going to finish the mix with my hands just to get to a shaggy dough. And then of course the next steps are to let it rest for 30 minutes, stretch and fold it, repeat the 30-minute rest 3 more times or 2 more times, and do another stretch and fold, and then we'll get to bulk proofing. I'm not doing this video live, so I'll actually be able to film the process all day today, and you'll be able to see the whole thing in this video. So here we go. You know, surprisingly, it doesn't actually smell that much like beer. But beer, just like starter, is fermented, right? It's just another fermented thing. And I like Bud Light because it's pretty pure. There's not really much in it, and it's also quite a light beer. I wasn't really looking for a super strong beer taste. What I'm more curious about is how is this dough gonna rise and what is the crumb gonna be like at the end. So I've been pretty excited about this. Right off the bat, as I'm mixing this up, I can tell you that the dough is coming together quicker than when I just use water. It's initially smoother right off the bat. And I would say it's probably less sticky. So when we do the beginner bread recipe and we mix it up, usually we end up with a shaggy dough and it's sticking to everything. But you can see right now, it's shaggy, but it's not that sticky. So I'll come back in 30 minutes and I'll do my first stretch and fold, and then we'll work our way through those and get to bulk proofing. Okay, so we've let the beer dough rest now for 30 minutes, and now we're going to do our first stretch and fold. Now, usually with regular sourdough bread, I do 3 or 4 stretch and folds every 30 minutes. I'm experienced, so I can actually tell by the feel and look of the dough when it's ready to begin bulk proofing. But as a beginner, the safest thing to do is just to do 3 or 4, because that's going to ensure that you've built enough strength. So here's the dough after it's been sitting for half an hour. I'm just going to get my hand a little bit damp. I'm going to reach underneath the dough. I'm going to pull straight up, and I'm going to flip it down on top of itself. And then I'm going to turn, and same thing on the next side. Right off the bat, this beer dough is actually feeling the same level of smoothness that my dough feels after 3 stretch and folds, and this is only 1 stretch and fold. So that's certainly an interesting concept. Now, when you know that you've built enough strength in your dough, or the way that you know you've built enough strength in your dough is when it resists you when you go to stretch. So I don't know if you noticed, but when I did that first stretch and fold, I was able to pull way up and flip down. And now if you look, when I pull on it, it's resisting, right? It's got elasticity. The only purpose of stretching and folding is to build strength in your bread. And you know your bread is strong when it stays elastic like that. So I'm going to let this rest 30 minutes one more time and do another stretch and fold, but I'm starting to suspect that with beer bread, perhaps we don't need to build as much strength. Maybe the bubbly fermentedness of the beer makes it so that it goes a little faster, and that would definitely be interesting and fun. So I'll be back in 30 minutes. Okay, so it's been 30 minutes again, and this is my second stretch and fold with the beer bread. So right now it's not nearly as shaggy as when we first mix it. It's a little bit stiff, but it's got some good movement. It's nice and shiny and smooth, but I'm just going to get a look-see and see how it feels here. So I'm going to go underneath, stretch it up, bring it down. So you notice on the first stretch and fold, there's lots of movement there. My second stretch and fold, it's resisting me just a little. My third stretch and fold, it just lifts up. So there's no question, this dough is actually pretty strong. I'm gonna try the window pane test here. So the window pane test is where you stretch your bread and see if it will create a membrane without ripping. So I just did it there. So it's still really easily failing the window pane test. So I'm just going to be safe. Even though this bread feels smooth and strong, this dough feels smooth and strong, I'm just going to be safe and go with at least 3 stretch and folds. So I'm going to let it rest for 34 minutes and come back and give it a stretch and fold. And then probably at that point, I'll move it into the proofing container, one last quick stretch and fold, and then let it bulk rise for the rest of the day. So I'll see you back again in 30 minutes. Okay, so it's been another 30 minutes and my dough is looking nice and smooth. So I'm going to give it one more stretch and fold, and then I'm going to move it into the proofing containers. And I'll show you that method. Using proofing containers can really help you perfect your bulk proofing, which is one of the essential processes. So I'm just going to reach under my dough, stretch it up. As you can see, it's getting a lot stronger than it was when I first started stretching and folding it at the beginning of this mix. I actually really like how this dough feels. And you know, it doesn't really smell like beer at all. So that's interesting. I wonder if we're going to taste it. So now what I'm going to do is take my dough and move it into this proofing container. So when I bulk proof my dough, I use containers like these, and I move them into the containers and I mark the height of the dough where it started, because then I can see when it's fully proofed. With this bread, I'm probably going to let it rise to about 75% increase, so not quite double, and then I'm going to pre-shape it, shape it, and bake it. So I've got it in my proofing container, and you know, it's kind of just sitting there. As it settles, it's going to sink down and then it's going to rise up. So I just take a marker like this and I mark where the dough was when I started. It's messy and everything else, and I even sort of mark where the little voids are so that I have an understanding of what it looked like. So there we go. So later, when I come back and resume making this video, I'll show you how much it's risen. Now this bulk proofing itself is an essential step. Using the containers is totally optional, but 100% of the time when we're seeing somebody posting a bread that's either proofed too much or too little, and has resulted in, you know, either a very dense loaf or a very flat loaf, we always suggest using this technique to prevent the dough from overproofing or underproofing. And also, once you're confident and comfortable, you can use this technique to play with. Is 30% rise good for my dough, or is 100% rise good for my dough? Start adjusting it in there. So this just sort of gives you a stabilization. So I'll be back somewhere between 4 and 8 hours from now once this is risen, and we'll go through shaping, and baking. So I'm back, and if you've been watching the video, then you might notice that I'm fresh out of the shower and changed. Yesterday, after I got the dough into the proofing container, my day ended up getting pretty busy. We have a big storm coming and we needed to get ready for it. So what I did was I took my dough off the counter. Normally with these proofing containers, I would just let it sit on the counter until it rises. Usually takes between 4 and 6 hours, and I'm usually going for about a 75% rise. But since I had to go do some things yesterday, I just took my dough, stuck it in the fridge, left it overnight. Now I'm up early this morning. As soon as I got up, I pulled this out, sat it on the counter, let it finish proofing. My Dutch oven is in the oven, preheating now as we speak. So what I'm going to do is show you how the dough should look when it's proofed, dump it out, pre-shape it, and let it sit for 30 minutes. And then we'll get the final shape on and a score, and get it in the oven and see how this bread turns out. So when you look at the dough, it's nice and smooth. It's all pushed up against the sides of the bowl. It's not doubled off the top of this line, but you'll notice that yesterday when I drew this line, it wasn't touching the edges. It was lifted up from the bottom. So the dough has expanded up and down and sideways, and I can see that it's at double. The sides are sort of clinging to the edge and the top is rounded. So that's a good indicator that there's lots of air in there. So pre-shaping is one of the processes that I consider to be essential. What it does is it starts to build some tension in the dough. It also puts a little bit of a skin on the edge of the dough and makes it so that it's much less sticky. So one of the most common things that we see is my dough is really sticky and I couldn't shape it. So you'll notice that when it comes out, it's, you know, it's kind of a mess. So we're going to use no water, no flour, just a dry counter. Most people would use a bench scraper. You can find them on Amazon. I'll have all kinds of links posted in the description of this video. But I just use this dull, flat-sided knife. And the idea is that we're going to touch the dough as little as possible and just start to work around it and bring it into itself until it starts to puff itself up into a ball that's shaped like dough. So all I do is I use my hand to push and my knife to drag, and I start bringing the dough around. So again, hand to push, and already on the sides you can see that it's starting to get smooth. And as I keep doing this, even the top, so right now what we've got is sort of a lumpy top and the sides are coming. Well, as we do this, the dough continues to work under and into itself. It's trapping air bubbles, you know, it's building tension. It's sort of giving the gluten a notification that, hey, we're going to become a loaf of bread. Oh my gosh, I wanted to mention, I got these earbuds for Christmas, and right now it's pretty loud in my house. My oven has the loudest fan that anyone's ever heard, and when I wear these things, it's like I'm completely in the video. So if you're watching, as the dough is turning, it's starting to, let's come this way, it's starting to really get smooth and get a nice skin on it. And when I let go of it, it's starting to stay in a ball. When I let it sit for 30 minutes, it will eventually start to flatten out. And then that's when we're going to shift it into the final shaping mode. So if you look at the dough, there's sort of a shiny skin on the outside. Now it's not so sticky. There's bubbles, right? So we hear a lot about degassing dough. That comes after final shaping. Once you've got your final shape on your dough, you want to be gentle with it and not push the air out. But at this point, you actually can't really handle it too much because we're trapping air in. So the movement of the knife sliding under the bread is actually pushing the bread underneath itself, right? And your hand is just acting as a guide. And so it's making a dome. So what I'm going to do now is let my Dutch oven continue to preheat, leave this sitting here on the counter for 30 minutes, and then in 30 minutes I'll come back, we'll get the dough shaped and into the oven to bake. Talk to you soon. Okay, so the dough that I just pre-shaped has now rested for 30 minutes, and you can see from a second ago to now that it's settled a little. So I'm going to shape it and get it in the oven to bake. You could cold proof here if you wanted to, but cold proofing is an optional step, and I'm just not going to do it today because I'm dying to see this get baked. So I've got a little bit of regular flour. You can use rice flour or any flour you like. I'm going to use it to get my parchment paper ready and to shape, to sprinkle on the counter while I shape the bread, and also when I score the bread. So first I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of flour onto my parchment paper here so my bread doesn't stick while it's cooking. I'll set that aside. And now I'm just going to generously, but not too much, get some flour onto my counter so that the bread doesn't stick while I'm shaping it. So to shape, I'm just going to get my fingers under the front of the bread. I'm going to lift straight up and let it stretch a little, and I'm going to lay it out. And I'm just going to give it a little bit of a stretch to get it into a rectangle shape, but I'm not going to be too rough with it because it's nice and full of air and we don't want to degas it. So I'm going to make a pamphlet. I'll fold the top third down and I'll fold the bottom third up. And I'm just going to sort of tuck my ends a little. And now I'm going to come to the end of the bread, and as I'm rolling it, I'm just going to stretch it. There we go, have a nice loaf. So now, normally if you were cold proofing, you would flip this into a banneton, and I like to seam up my ends and seam up on top, cover it, put it in the fridge and leave it overnight. But I'm going to bake this right away today, so I'm just going to shape it a little more for going into the oven. So I'm just going to get my ends tucked in, this, and I'm just going to pull and drag a little bit just to build some good tension in the bread. Good tension and air in your bread gives it a good oven spring. So that's pretty good. Now I'll just sort of mold it into the shape that I want. I'm going to go for round today. Being very gentle, not pushing, not forcing out any air. So very similar to the technique that we used with the pre-shaping, except a lot more gentle this time around. All right, so now I'm going to bring that parchment paper that I floured over and set my loaf on it. And I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of flour on top before I score so that when it comes out of the oven, the flour stays there and it makes the score pop a little bit. You've got two kinds of scores. You've got a functional score, which is on an angle to the bread about 1/2 centimeter deep, and that actually allows steam to escape and causes your bread to rise in the oven. And then you've got decorative scores, which just look pretty. And you know, they of course themselves will let a little bit of air escape too, and can definitely assist with oven spring, but in most cases all you actually need is a functional score. I just want to get this bread nicely shaped. Okay, great. So I just use a little, whatever this is called, and coat the top of my bread. Lovely. I like to just brush a lot of this excess off the parchment paper because we don't really need it. Some around the edges won't hurt, but all right. So now I'm going to take my trusty razor and on an angle to the bread. So on a 45-degree angle to wherever you're scoring on the bread. So the farther you get to the side, the more perpendicular to the, or parallel to the counter it will get. The farther you get to the middle, the more perpendicular it will get. So I'm just going to cut a long functional score along the side of this bread. And with my functional score, I like to actually go over it twice. And then I'm just going to put a little bit of decoration on. Nice little wheat, maybe like a mini wheat. Bud Light and mini wheats. Okay, there we go. All right, so now I'm just going to move my camera over near my oven and show you how I get this popped into the Dutch oven and talk about getting it cooked. Okay, so I'm over here by my oven and I do everything I can to keep the bottom of my loaf very soft. My Dutch oven's been in the oven at 450 degrees for about an hour, warming up. I also have a tray of water on the bottom rack underneath my Dutch oven, and I'll leave that in the oven for all but the last 10 minutes of baking the bread. I also put crinkled up tin foil in the bottom of my Dutch oven and then my parchment paper on top, and the combination of the water under the Dutch oven and the tin foil under the parchment paper makes it so that the bottom of my bread doesn't get really hard. So let's get it in. So first I'm just going to stick this very carefully because this is screaming hot. Get the tin foil in, and I just let it sit there. And then I'm going to use the parchment paper that I put the bread on as a sling to lift the loaf and set it down inside my Dutch oven. So I'm using a 4-quart oval Dutch oven. I'll post some links to some tools you might like on Amazon in the description. The reason I use these oval ones is because I can fit 2 side by side in my tiny oven. So I'm just going to pop this back in the oven. And at this point, I usually set a timer for 30 minutes. And then after 30 minutes, I will pop the lid off and put it back in and cook it for another 25 minutes. If I find that at that 30 minutes, my score isn't really, I'm not starting to see that ear coming, I might actually recut my score at that point as well. So 30 minutes, lid off, back into the oven, and then 20 to 30 more minutes baking. And I use a kitchen thermometer to make sure that my bread's at 205. Then in the last 10 minutes, I will pull the tray of water out from underneath the Dutch oven just to let it finish cooking the bottom, and then pull my bread out and let it cool. So over the next little bit while I'm cooking the bread, I'll just take a couple of quick videos so you can see what happens, and then soon we'll see the final loaf and cut into it. Okay, let's cut into it. So here's the beer bread. It doesn't smell anything like beer. It just smells like delicious bread. But here's hoping the inside is perfect. Let's see. Yay! We did it! I wish I could find a way to make it so that you could feel how good this bread tasted. OMG, it is so delicious. There was a little gummy spot and I was worried, but you don't even notice it. You've got to try this. Thanks for watching.